The neighborhood was the kind of place where appearances mattered more than substance. Perfectly trimmed hedges, identical driveways, and rows of polished cars lined the street, each one representing a family who paid not only for their house, but for the illusion of order that came with it. The HOA thrived on that illusion, enforcing it with a rigid hand. And within that system lived Karen, the self-appointed enforcer who carried herself as though she were the president of the entire neighborhood, clipboard in hand, ready to strike. The trouble began when a newcomer parked his modest sedan in what he thought was a communal space. It was a small act, something that in most neighborhoods would pass without notice. But here, where the lines of the pavement were treated as sacred borders, Karen noticed. She stormed out of her home, the kind of house where blinds were always tilted just enough to spy on the street, and took it upon herself to correct the perceived offense. The narration of her disapproval spread quickly. Neighbors whispered over fences, recounting how she cornered the driver, her arms crossed tightly, her voice sharp with entitlement. She told him this was her street, her rules, her territory. The HOA, she claimed, would be on her side. Her sense of authority radiated in every word, like she was confident the neighborhood itself bent to her will. But what Karen had underestimated was the way small stories evolve. The HOA had grown tired of her endless complaints. Every week she filed grievances, trash cans out too early, lawns mowed a day too late, cars parked a little too close to the curb. What she saw as diligence, others saw as obsession. Her name had become synonymous with conflict, her presence a storm cloud hovering over every community gathering. So when the board reviewed the complaint she had filed about the parking incident, they didn't simply nod along as they once might have. Instead, they looked at the facts. The spot in question wasn't hers. It wasn't marked as private. It wasn't assigned to anyone. It was community property, and for the first time in a long time, the HOA considered what it might mean to finally push back against her overreach. As Karen celebrated prematurely, certain that her complaint would result in the removal of the newcomer's car, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. People who had stayed silent began to murmur with interest. They wanted to see if this would be the moment the HOA finally clipped Karen's wings. The man at the center of it all carried himself calmly. He didn't respond to Karen's aggression, didn't feed into her narrative, defy her. Others whispered with delight, their resentment of her antics finally finding a release. But Karen was not the type to retreat. To her, this wasn't just about parking. It was about control, about her identity as the gatekeeper of the neighborhood's order. Her retaliation was immediate. She began documenting every move the man made, the time he parked, the angle of his car, the condition of his tires. She snapped pictures at dawn, scribbled notes late at night, filed endless emails to the board accusing him of violations both real and imagined. Her clipboard became a weapon, her obsession unrelenting. But the more she pushed, the more resistance she encountered. The board, weary of her tirades, began ignoring her complaints. Neighbors who once tolerated her scolding started avoiding her altogether. On walks down the street, conversations hushed when she passed. Her power was slipping and she knew it. The man, meanwhile, carried on with quiet composure. His car sat undisturbed in its rightful place, a symbol of the shift in power. Each time Karen glared from her window, he remained unfazed, and that calmness infuriated her more than any argument could have. Desperation drove her to escalate. She called the police, reporting the car as illegally parked. Officers arrived, but after reviewing the HOA's documentation, they left with nothing more than polite shrugs. To Karen, it felt like betrayal, from the board, from the authorities, from the neighborhood she had once dominated. As weeks stretched into months, her home, once the command center of her authority, became a fortress of bitterness. Blinds drawn tighter, mutters louder, she plotted endlessly. Yet the community had already moved on, their focus shifting to block parties, garden competitions, and small joys that no longer included her oversight. Still, Karen wasn't finished. In her mind, this was not defeat. It was the opening act of a larger battle. She told herself she would reclaim her power, no matter the cost. And as autumn leaves began to fall, she set her sights on a new plan, one that would test just how far she was willing to go to protect her crumbling empire. By the time winter arrived, the neighborhood had grown accustomed to the uneasy truce. Karen brooding in her house, the newcomer enjoying his spot without issue, the HOA cautiously optimistic that peace might last. But under the surface, tension remained. Everyone knew Karen would not stay silent forever. Her final attempt at reclaiming control came in the form of a petition. She marched door to door, clipboard in hand, demanding signatures to revoke the man's parking rights. Her pitch was fierce, but the reception was not what she expected. Doors closed gently in her face. Neighbors who had once nodded along now refused to engage. Some even laughed, shaking their heads at the persistence of her vendetta. The turning point came at the next HOA meeting. Karen stormed in, her binder overflowing with complaints and petitions. She stood at the podium, her voice ringing with indignation, declaring that the neighborhood's order was at stake. But instead of applause, she was met with silence. The board members, weary and resolute, listened patiently before issuing their final statement. The parking spot was permanent. The decision would not be revisited. Furthermore, after years of disruptive behavior, Karen was formally warned. Any future harassment of neighbors would result in fines and potential legal action. It was the first time she had been confronted so directly, the first time her authority had been stripped in front of the very people she sought to control. For Karen, it was devastating. For the neighborhood, it was liberating. In the weeks that followed, a transformation unfolded. Without Karen's constant interference, the community thrived. Neighbors connected more freely, gatherings were warmer, and the air felt lighter. The man, whose only desire had been to park his car in peace, became a quiet symbol of change, a reminder that one small act of resistance could unravel years of misplaced power. Karen remained in her home, her presence diminished. She still peeked through the blinds, still muttered about injustices no one else could see, but her reign was over. The HOA, once her stage, had turned against her, and the neighborhood, once her captive audience, no longer cared for the drama. In the end, the story of the parking spot became more than a tale of entitlement. It was a story of balance restored, of a community choosing harmony over control, and of one woman learning painfully that power built on fear is fragile. And so the neighborhood carried on, quieter, brighter, and free from the shadow that had long darkened its streets.